Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Signatures, Signatures, and Even More Signatures. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Bryan Simon, SANS Principal Instructor and lead author of SEC 401, Security Essentials Bootcamp Style. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Bryan.
Thank you for that introduction, Carol. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to anyone who is listening to this webcast right now. It's really great to have everyone all together for this discussion on signatures, and even more signatures. Again, as Carol introduced myself, I'm Bryan Simon. I'm the lead author of SEC 401, our Security Essentials class. One of the big parts of something that I instruct when it comes to SEC 401 are concepts related to cryptography. Now, when it comes to cryptography in and of itself, it tends to be one of the most misunderstood areas of information security, and a misunderstanding can only lead to issues. There are specific implementations of cryptographic functionality that not only can be misunderstood, but if understood and applied well, can really be a boon to our information security program. And so with that, let's jump into this presentation where we'll go through a bit of a review on some cryptographic concepts and foundations that are necessary to understand the remainder of the presentation, and then circle back to some of the reasons why I put this presentation together, as it specifically refers to the idea of a digital signature. And that's what this presentation is really about, that being digital signatures itself. So again, welcome, and let's get started. As I just alluded to, cryptography is easily one of the most misunderstood concepts that we have when it comes to cybersecurity or information technology. The big issue with the notion that it's a misunderstood concept is how much it's relied upon, combined with the idea that it might be misapplied. We rely on a lot of cryptographic concepts for some very important areas of information security, specifically and most often referred to the areas of confidentiality. We want to provide data security, so we're going to encrypt our data. That's one of the most commonly used phrases that's playing in this realm of cryptographic understanding. The issue, though, to try and tie together and to give us clarity right away is that these concepts are easy to misunderstand, but are heavily relied upon, leading almost to a false sense of security in combination with an overconfidence. A false sense of security can only lead to more issues than anything else. But maybe on its face, the best question would be, well, why is it so misunderstood? Or even better on top of that, why does it end up being misapplied relative to a misunderstanding? Part of the problem right away is that those who implement a lot of these controls are not always directly from the security realm of the conversation. It's many times that just traditional administrators in the IT realm are responsible for applying some of these cryptographic concepts, encrypting databases, assisting with signatures for emails, authentication practices, and so on. Now, in no way, shape, or form is that to imply that administrators should not be the ones doing the job. The point is, we often don't provide the appropriate security knowledge and training that's really important for an administrator to be aware of so that they can do their job better. Because often we don't deploy the security controls, but we do have to assist those who do deploy the security controls. If an administrator by regulation is told that they have to implement something and it ends up being implemented improperly, then not only is that a lack of compliance with the obligation, more importantly, it weakens the entire organization because of a false sense of security. Any overconfidence leads to a much bigger fall than anything else. So with that, then, the idea of this presentation will be that we can share information with our teams as well to help them to better implement the controls that we rely upon them to implement on our behalf. So as we get into some of that, maybe what we need is a better understanding to make sure we're on the right page as well. The first part of that understanding is to realize that the term cryptography is not synonymous with encryption. Whenever we're talking things like data security, we're going to digitally encrypt something in some way, shape, or form, people refer that to the idea of cryptography. Or to say it the other way around, cryptography, when most people use it in their lexicon, when it's brought up in conversation, they're talking about encryption. Encryption, though, is but only one aspect that relates to the overall understanding of cryptographic concepts. Or to put it differently, cryptography is the practice and the study of the techniques that allow for secure communication, all in the presence of a known adversary. Encryption is an aspect of something we can achieve by leveraging a cryptographic system. Encryption might be used more specifically to achieve confidentiality, confidentiality being one of 4 goals that can be supplied in a cryptographic method. For cryptographic systems and cryptography overall, confidentiality, therefore brought by encryption, is one of the most important and well focused on areas, but there are other areas that are not less important. They just have a different circumstance and a different application. There are times where even encryption itself, or the idea of confidentiality, is not the primary concern, but maybe we are concerned with integrity. That's the idea of verifying that something was not modified since the time it was created. Integrity is met by the use of hashing cryptographic systems. Authentication. We know how important authentication is today and how, sadly, still too often we rely upon weak methods for authentication verification like passwords. One great way to do authentication more securely is to leverage the cryptographic power of asymmetric cryptography. This is the idea of public-private key pair, and that also leads to some of the concepts we'll discuss today. Last but not least, when we bring up the idea of digital signatures are the goal to achieve in a digital world what we achieve in the physical world with a physical signature. A physical signature on a piece of paper attests our agreement with whatever it is that's in the piece of paper. If we sign a contract, we are attesting our agreement and our desire to abide by the content of that contract by the attachment of a physical signature. In a court of law, a physical signature has a lot of power and value. Your Honor, I did not agree with the contract. Is this your signature? Well, yes, it is, Your Honor. Well, why did you sign it if you didn't agree with it? The power of a physical signature in the real world has the necessity to be equivalent today in today's digital world, especially as we move more and more digital, especially related to the last 10 months of what we're all going through. The idea of having a signature hold up in court is the idea of a non-repudiation. Non-repudiation is very specifically technically applied is what we're going to discuss today with the idea of digital signatures. Now, as we see here, it's actually a combination of hashing and asymmetric protection at the same time. So a combination of 2 of the other systems. Maybe though, again, just to make sure we're on the same page, one thing that I think that could be really beneficial is to show that the different goals of a cryptographic system are met by different types of cryptographic algorithms. And well, of course, algorithms, there can be many that try to supply the same capability, just with different names themselves. To tie it all together, what we see here is that confidentiality is met through the use of symmetric cryptography. And some of the names of the algorithms that relate to that concept are things like triple DES, AES, and so on. Integrity, as already alluded to, is met through the use of hashing algorithms, names like MD5, SHA-1, SHA-256, etc. Authentication, very important concept, of course, can be met by the use of asymmetric cryptography. We have names like ECC, RSA, Al-Gamal. And once again, non-repudiation is a combination of 2 of these systems. the idea of asymmetric for authentication plus hashing for integrity. Integrity plus authentication can bind us to the notion of who provided a communication, and that the communication we received is not only the communication that was sent, but it's the communication that was meant to be sent, the idea of a digital signature. As we start to move towards the idea of getting into digital signatures, there's really one other thing I just want to draw to our attention so that we can start to tie everything together. The other major difference between the different cryptographic systems is the number of keys that are leveraged. Just like a key in a physical world can lock and unlock a physical lock, a digital key in a digital world can lock and unlock our digital locks. For symmetric cryptographic systems, which are leveraged again for the idea of confidentiality, the idea of traditional encryption, we'll have only but one key. The key that we use to encrypt is the key that we use to decrypt. It's the exact same key. In asymmetric cryptographic systems, there are two keys that are leveraged. These two keys are very specific and very special in the idea that they are mathematically related keys. A cryptographic system will generate both keys simultaneously. And what makes them so unique as an application is that whatever is done with one key, only the second key, or rather said the other key, can undo. One key to lock, the other key to unlock. To try and re-describe this, because this does become the foundation for the rest of our conversation today, whatever you do with one key, only the other key can undo. The keys that we're using here, I'll just give the name initially of key 1 and key 2. Key 1, key 2 form a pair of keys, a key pair. Key 1 and key 2 are created simultaneously by a cryptographic system. If we were to encrypt data leveraging key 1, only key 2 could decrypt. And if we were to encrypt with key 2, then only key 1 could decrypt. It's this very important significance that plays into, again, our concept of digital signatures, which we will be getting to here very shortly. I'm going to change the name of the keys, and it's the name of the keys that causes the most confusion. So if we just hang on for a few moments more, we're able to make those connections more easily and understand the names of the keys and what they truly mean. With that being said then, instead of saying key 1 and key 2, I'm going to say public key and private key. Public, private, key pair, cryptography. If you encrypt with the public key, only the corresponding private key could decrypt. And as strange as it seems, but there is a use, if the private key encrypts, then only the public key can decrypt. Don't let the names confuse us. Those are just the proper names, and that will be an explanation of how they work as a part of the remainder of our conversation today. Last but not least, hashing. In hashing, we discussed the notion of no keys, because this isn't an encryption, it's a transformation. With a hashing concept, we take a plain text, that is anything in its original and unprotected form. We run this plain text through a hashing function, and we are resulting in a hash value. A hash value is what's used to verify the integrity of the plain text that was provided to the hashing function. It's hashing and asymmetric that are combined together to leverage digital signatures. So with that then, let's dig a little deeper into these important concepts. First off, hashing. With a hashing function, the one-way mathematical transformation, we should probably understand what's meant by one way. We're going to take an object, something of value. We want to verify its integrity. We provide that value to a hashing algorithm, and we get a hash value that's outputted. As strange as it would seem, the hash value is irreversible. It's a one-way mathematical transformation. Perhaps the easier way to start to look at it would be to do a slight demonstration. So let's do that now then. What I happen to have here on my machine, a simple text file. This file is called sensitive.txt. For this file, sensitive.txt, inside the file it says, this data is sensitive. Please verify the signature before trusting. Before we get to the signatures, let's focus more specifically on the integrity. I have a tool called MD5 Deep that allows me to generate an MD5 hash of an object. When asking for an MD5 hash of sensitive.txt, this value is produced for me. The value that we see here is the hash that's related to the file sensitive.txt. That hash is not reliant upon the name of the object, the date or the time, the last time it was modified, its size, its directory location. None of that is relevant. What the hashing function is doing is taking the binary ones and zeros that make that object, sensitive.txt, unique. The binary ones and zeros that make that file are what's provided to the hashing function, and this value that we see, the BB, DD, and so on, that value measures the uniqueness of the object. It's not the content of the object, it's the uniqueness of the content. Think of it like a fingerprint. Sometimes, though, this is still a bit of a confusing subject. I mean, it's very abstract. So I'll just describe it in a different way. When using MD5 is the example here, and yes, MD5 does have issues. That's beside the point. It's just a simple way to do a demonstration. For MD5 hashing, the output is always 128 bits in length, or to say differently, 16 bytes. If I have a 100 megabyte plain text object, the output hash is only 16 bytes. If I have a 4 gigabyte file, the output hash is 16 bytes. There would be no way to go backward from 16 bytes of output to the uniqueness of 4 gigabytes of input. Or to say it differently, there is a reduction component when it comes to the notion or the idea of a hashing function. All of that being said, the most important takeaway is that there is no reversal, and that it's the idea of a hash value that provides for integrity. If an object was to be modified, the hash value would change. Let's make a change to the file just to show that very quickly. We'll make a simple change. We'll take off the dot, the period, at the end of that sentence. That's a very small change. But when we generate the hash once again, we see that the hash has changed quite dramatically. In fact, there is no apparent pattern or mapping between the two, even though the objects are very similar, the only difference here being a period at the end of a sentence. So how does this work for integrity then? If we know the original hash, we can verify that the subsequent hash is different. If we have an object that's never supposed to change, then we can measure its hash on a regular basis with a simple automation. If the hash is the same as the original intended hash, there's been no modification, no alert. If the hash is different, we can generate an alert in a more real-time aspect and then do an incident response if that would be necessary to show that data that was sensitive and important has been manipulated. Integrity. That's where hashing fits into the picture. With that being said, though, again, how does this tie into signatures? Well, remember that signatures, or that is digital signatures, are a combination of hashing for integrity plus authentication, asymmetric protection. Let's continue to build upon this understanding then. Here's a simple example of two people who need to communicate in the presence of a known adversary, Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob are the names of characters that are often used to describe cryptographic concepts and their need. Alice and Bob need to communicate in the presence of an always known adversary who would technically be in the middle of a communication. Alice and Bob assume at all times that their communication could be intercepted, and that's how we can start to come to the ideas of, well, applying the need for cryptographic understanding. Let's go ahead and take this a little closer then as a look. And the one thing I'll say right here is that for this initial example, we're going to assume there is no interception by a third party. We're going to assume that a communication will be sent from Alice to Bob, and that this communication is not intercepted. That's the first example we need to take a look at. Alice writes an email to Bob. That will be the message. This is an email. And the email is plain text. It's unprotected. There's no concept of encryption. We're simply talking here integrity. Alice wants to send a message to Bob, and Bob wants to verify the integrity of what he received. Alice writes her email message. The message goes through a hashing algorithm, just like we saw in the demo I did, to generate a hash value, the fingerprint of integrity. The email and the hash itself are sent together, just like you would send any email. Think of it like an attachment to an email. That is the hash being attached to the email itself. This is sent across the communication, and this is received by Bob. Bob has received two parts to the communication. The original hash of integrity that Alice generated for the message she wrote, plus the email that Bob has received. This is what he's received. He's going to take the hash that Alice generated and put it to the side. This is the hash of what she wrote. He has, though, a message that he's received. He's not aware if the message he received is actually the message that Alice sent. To determine that, then, he takes the email, the one he received. He also runs it through a hashing algorithm, the same algorithm Alice used, so let's pretend it's MD5, to generate a hash. So again, to say differently, he takes a hash of what he received. He then does a comparison, the hash of what he received with the hash of what Alice computed based on what she wrote. If they match, Bob knows that this email did not change in transit. This email has integrity. Now, yes, this is why I caveated right at the beginning of this example. We're assuming there's no interception. Because if there is interception, an adversary could easily intercept the email, discard the original hash that Alice computed, modify the email, generate a new hash of integrity, and then attach that. And Bob would be unaware that Alice's email is not actually Alice's email. The only way that he could really verify this would be to contact Alice directly, maybe a telephone call, to verify and validate the content. But what if Bob actually doesn't really know Alice? Or to say it differently, I mean, what if Bob, even telephoning Alice, ended up speaking to someone that wasn't Alice? When two parties are communicating across insecure mediums, especially the idea of the internet, this would be completely unacceptable. So why do we describe it then? Because we're building the foundation of what we need to understand as it applies to digital signatures. This problem here that Alice and Bob need to communicate, even if the communication is intercepted, and yet still need to rely upon the integrity of the email, is better suited then with the solution of a digital signature. So here we are, we're at the heart of the matter of this conversation. A digital signature, again, is the idea that in the physical world we have a physical signature. If Alice was to write a physical letter and send it to Bob, she can sign the letter. We do that quite often when it comes to traditional mail. Sincerely yours, Alice. When Bob receives the letter, he knows what Alice's signature looks like, and he has confidence in the letter that he received in the traditional postal system. That signature, that concept of the physical real world, we absolutely need in today's digital world. A digital signature, therefore, then, just to make sure, again, we always understand, is the concept that we can verify and validate a digital object as to the integrity of the object and attach it to whom created or generated that object. Now, digital signature, some people think it means you take a picture of your physical signature, a digital copy of your signature, and then attach it to a digital document. In some respects, that's what we're trying to achieve, but we don't use a picture for that. Anyone could take a picture and attach that image, so that doesn't give us the confidence we need, but that's the idea or the concept that we're trying to leverage. With that being said then, how does a digital signature work? And how do we attach it back to the previous example? With that, let's go ahead and take this next approach slowly. Back to asymmetric cryptography one more time. In asymmetric cryptographic systems, there are two keys, the public key and the private key. The idea in public-private key pair cryptography is that every individual, we'll just say on the planet, will have their own very unique public-private key pair. Everyone on the planet generates their own public and private key. The reason why one of the keys is called public is because it's the only time in a cryptographic sense we ever do this, we give it away to the general public. It's the private key that we keep secure and safe at all costs possible. It's the private key that gives the entire system its ability. And this means that Alice has Bob's public key, Bob has Alice's public key, Alice and Bob are my friends, so I have their public keys, they have my public key. Everyone on the planet has everyone else's public key. Let's walk through the example then to see how it works, because remember in asymmetric cryptography, whatever you do with one key, only the other key can undo. Just like before, Alice is going to write an email. And this email is not encrypted. There's no protection for confidentiality. It's just an email. Secondly, this email could be intercepted. And that's why we're doing the extra work that we see here to protect this email in transit. Just like before, the first thing Alice does before she sends the email is she generates a hash of integrity. She leverages the SHA-2 algorithm to generate the hash of uniqueness. Her email, here's the hash that verifies that email, just like before. The difference though this time is the hash needs to be protected before it's communicated. To protect it, Alice is going to encrypt. So yes, the hash itself becomes encrypted, the email's not, but the hash of integrity is going to be encrypted for confidentiality by leveraging Alice's private key. She uses her private key. She's the only person on the planet with her private key, and that's used to encrypt the hash of integrity. This is what's a digital signature. A digital signature is a fancy way of saying that a hash of integrity is encrypted by a sender's private key. They use their private key to sign the hash of integrity. This digital signature is sent with the email message across the wire. Now, we won't talk interception here. We'll just talk about it being received by Bob. Bob receives the message and the signature. The message that he received, he needs to verify. That's the idea. He's verifying what he received. So he takes his email and he runs that through the same hashing algorithm that Alice did, SHA-2. He now has a hash of what he received. He puts that to the side. What came with the email was a signature. Remember, this signature is the original hash encrypted with Alice's private key. Bob needs to decrypt it. If Alice's private key was used to encrypt, the only key that can ever decrypt is the mathematically related key, Alice's public key. Everyone has Alice's public key, including Bob. Bob takes Alice's public key and decrypts the signature. This brings him back to the original hash that Alice computed based on what she wrote. If the hashes match, he knows quite a bit. First, the message has integrity. The hashes, they match. The email he received, the email that Alice sent, the hashes were identical. This email was not modified in transit. Integrity. Step 1. Step 2. A second observation. Alice's public key was used to decrypt the signature. Alice's public key would have only worked had Alice's private key been used to begin with. Authentication. It's the trusting of Alice's public key that can verify what Alice did with her private key. This email was sent by Alice because her private key was used. That's authentication. Oh, but wait, how about this? Alice would have never taken the effort to encrypt a hash with her private key unless she wanted to do so. She would never have digitally signed her email unless she wanted Bob to have trust and confidence in the email he received. To say it all together, Alice is responsible for this very email, even in a court of law, a non-repudiation perspective. If Alice was to later say that she did not write this email, Alice has a lot of explaining to do. Alice is the only person on the planet with her private key. Alice knows to keep the private key safe and secure. Alice, if she didn't mean to send this email or that specific content of the email, then why did she digitally sign it? It's like in a court of law in a physical sense. You physically sign a document, you are attaching your attestation of agreement. Now, I want to make it clear I'm not a lawyer. I've never played one on television, and therefore I cannot give you legal advice. So always seek legal counsel in any of these concepts. But it's the idea behind it, how important it is as we move to a digital world. I think that if anything has really shown us in the past 10 months or so, that we will be pushing even more towards the idea of digital services for citizens of one's country. And as we move forward, digital signatures to prove the identity of a citizen when applying for things like government services will become increasingly more important. And they leverage the exact same concepts we're discussing here. The only foundational issue that still sits here in all of this is that, well, how do we know that Alice's public key is actually her public key? If you intend to have everyone on the planet have your public key, there's a lot of intrinsic trust in the idea that that belongs to a key pair. If someone gives me their public key and says it's theirs, I don't really know if it's theirs. In order to get trust in this entirety of a system would be to understand how they attach to the notion of certificates. Certificates can be a digital way to verify the ownership of a public key relative to the identity of the individual or entity that claims ownership. Or to say it differently, Bob can use a digital certificate to exchange his key with others. A certificate is a digital document that attests the identity of Bob and the ownership of Bob to his public key. These certificates are issued by trusted parties, certificate authorities. If we trust that a certificate authority does all the work to validate Bob and the ownership of Bob's key, then we can trust that certificate when we receive it. Again, these digital concepts are so abstract that there can be a physical equivalency that helps us to better understand. If someone walks up to me and they introduce themselves and they give me their name and they provide to me their passport to verify their identity, well, they give me a passport. I open up to the picture page. There's the name that they gave a claim of. The picture matches their face. And because it's a passport issued by their government, I have a lot of intrinsic trust. All things being equal, to get a passport, there should be a lot of work that has to be done before a passport is issued. Depends on the country, of course, where you live, but an example of in my country, I would have to provide a birth certificate. I'd have to provide other government issue identification, maybe like a driver's license. I would have to have my paperwork signed by a guarantor who says that they've known me for a period of time and can attach an attestation to my identity. The government wants all of this documentation before they issue a passport, because the moment someone has a passport in their possession, there's intrinsic trust that the issuing authority verified and validated all the information that went into the passport before creation. This is called a chain of trust. When someone hands me their passport, I don't need to see their birth certificate. I don't need to see their other identity documentation, because that work was already done. This here as well is a chain of trust, that if a certificate authority verifies an identity of Bob and that he owns his public key, they can create a certificate, like a digital passport. But all above all else, of course, how do we verify the certificate itself? It's simply a digital blob of data. Well, we continue on with the idea of signatures, where the certificate authority, they take a hash of integrity of the public key they received for the claiming entity, Bob. That hash is then encrypted with the CA's private key. They sign the hash of integrity. We have the CA's public key. We can then verify the signature. This chain of trust is so important in order to validate and to have sanctity and belief in the security of such a cryptographic system. So now that we've tied it all together, that's the idea of digital signatures as applied to email. But digital signatures as applied to email, those aren't the only examples of using digital signatures. And then, well, sometimes when I'm covering these topics, other questions naturally arrive, such as, well, how does this attach to things like DKIM, domain keys identified email? DKIM or SPF are email-related technologies that have security concepts, and so people are curious, how do they attach to the use of digital signatures? So with that, let's cover that next then, because it's a great question that often comes up quite heavily. What just is DKIM? How does it apply to email? If it leverages digital signatures, is it exactly the same as what we just covered? DKIM, or domain keys identified mail, is a protocol, a standard that was created to address a very serious issue that arises with emails. When we receive an email, the from on the email may not be truthful. Just like on a physical envelope that we put in the postal mail system, the post office is often not in a place of verification of what was written in the from. You can pretty much write what you want in the from on an envelope, and it would go in the mail, and the post office really has no way to verify it. Or to say differently, the from on a communication in the physical world can be spoofed. Someone can make a claim, but it may not be accurate. When it comes to emails, and the way the email protocols were designed decades ago, they never considered interception. They never considered that someone could pretend to be someone else. The from of an email can be spoofed. And yet, if it's spoofed and we trust what's there, then we might take action. We might click a link, go to a website that steals credentials. It appears to be from our bank, but it's not. And now we've given our credentials to the adversary, phishing. If we trust the email, we might click a link that leads to maliciousness and we get compromised. Spoofing is so much easier than not that DKIM was created as a technology where DKIM permits a person, a role, or an organization that owns a domain name to show a claim of ownership of an email that's transmitted. So let's say that differently. We own our domain name. We send emails from our domain. We want people to trust that those emails are legitimate. And if they can trust the ones that are legitimate, we want them to have a way of knowing the ones that are illegitimate. That's what the idea here is. So again, let's back up and understand. Our email servers are going to receive essentially private keys. Our email servers are the only ones that should be allowed to send email on behalf of our domain name. For every email that's sent through our email servers, those emails will be digitally signed in some way by the email servers themselves. Whenever an organization's email server receives an email, they can verify the validity of the email. They can go to a DNS server for the domain that sent the email and get the public key. This means that whenever we send email, the emails can be digitally signed automatically for the organization as a whole. This allows confidence in receiving email servers that those emails are legitimate. If someone spoofs the from on an email, a receiving email server can immediately verify that that email is spoofed because it's not digitally signed relative to the ownership of the actual domain that's being claimed. Now for DKIM then, to take it a little further, just exactly what is signed? That's a great question. There are headers on an email that indicate how the email was sent, who it was sent by, the email servers it transits through. In the header of an email can be the from header, the claimed ownership of the sender. Who is it from? That header will be digitally signed, and the message body is digitally signed as well. I just want to add a little bit of a caveat there. There can be differences in implementation, which can make things complex, but the goal was to at least sign the from header and the message body. There are other parts that can be signed. There are other parts that might be mandated by the concept of the standard itself, but I just wanted to focus on two, the from and the body. The signatures work exactly the same way we discussed. When a receiving email server has these emails, it reaches out to the DNS servers for the sending domain and retrieves the public key. The public key can then be used to verify the hash of integrity, just as we discussed. Now then, what does a signature prove and what does it not prove? A DKIM signature proves that an email was sent by an organization's email servers, so legitimacy is given. It also verifies and validates that the content of the message did not substantially change in transit, so that the message has integrity. What a DKIM signature does not do, however, it does not actually bind the person who wrote the email to their email. Let's explain that. The email servers are digitally signing every email to verify that the email originated at an organization. But that doesn't prove that a specific person at that organization wrote that specific email. Translation is, the email would still be digitally signed first by the sender and then signed again by the email servers. So now we have an attestation that the email was legitimate and also came from a specific individual. We would combine both together. If some of this sounds confusing, I would agree. And this is why I want to point out that a fantastic research paper was written on how widespread some of these technologies are actually deployed, such as DKIM. And then, well, if it sounds confusing, are there ways to get a better uptake on the powerful capabilities presented, but with less overhead and less struggle? I can't highly recommend this paper enough, and it's listed here on the slide. The slides are available to you afterwards. They will be posted for the presentation, and I highly recommend checking out Tim Lansing's paper in the SANS reading room. Not only does Tim discuss DKIM, but he discusses the other related technologies of DMARC, which is the idea of, domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance, along with SPF, the Sender Policy Framework, which email servers are allowed to send emails whether or not you ever attach a digital signature. So 3 technologies that can be used together, but can be very confusing, explained more easily, and even a tool given to the community to more easily instantiate these powerful needs. So with that, I can't highly recommend it enough. Now that's how DKIM comes up and how it relates to email signatures. But once again, signatures are not exclusive to email-based communication. How about another example in a different applied sense. Digital signatures in conjunction or correlation with incident response. Adversaries need to persist. Adversaries need to survive a restart of a computer. Adversaries leverage many techniques to remain in one's environment post-compromise. One of the ways to maintain a presence could be to either hide or to manipulate their presence by modifying system executables. If an adversary overwrites an executable like dir in Windows to get a directory listing, like ls in Linux to get a directory listing, that's what we call a file level rootkit. You run an executable that you believe is trusted, but it's actually no longer trusted because it's the adversary's version of your tool. To translate it, you run dir or ls to get a list of files because you think something is suspicious, and the list of files that you get from the file system is accurate, except it doesn't show the adversary's files. They're excluded. This is a file level rootkit. For a file level rootkit, we could leverage the idea of hashing to detect a change. But even better than just having a hash, why not a digital signature? Many vendors today, or I should say more vendors than at least before, will digitally sign the executables they create. When they write software, they take the software code once it's finished, once it's compiled, they take its executable and they create a hash of integrity, just like we've discussed. They will then take the hash of integrity and encrypt it by leveraging their private key. The vendor's private key is used to create a signature. If we have the vendor's public key, not only can we verify the hash of integrity, but we can verify that this was the hash that the author intended. It's a digitally signed executable. An example is that Microsoft will digitally sign many of their executables for things like the Windows operating system and other software that they create. If we can verify digital signature, we can verify very quickly integrity and its origination. Now let's flip all this around. How does it apply to incident response? If an adversary violates the integrity of a system executable, the signature will immediately invalidate. This is better than just collecting hashes because we'd have to have the original hashes and the subsequent hashes. In a digital signature, all we have to do is verify the signature. We don't need the original hash. If the signature invalidates, it invalidates. We don't have to understand the concept of the original hash is what I'm getting at here. If the majority of executables that were installed on a system are digitally signed, the moment they're modified by an adversary, the game is up. As long as we pay attention, of course, to that invalidation. If an adversary validates an executable, we could even, during system startup, verify the executables. If any are modified, we could stop the startup of the system. These are powerful techniques that, when combined with hardware, can really be a boon to our security, even for kernel level rootkits. The only problem is not all digital signatures are created equal when it comes to executables. A great research paper that was written on this concept, Joel Mendonça, the link in the SANS reading room is also on the slide. And his research paper, he found an issue that was quite interesting that we can learn from. In a Windows operating system, many of the executables, as mentioned, are digitally signed by Microsoft. There are traditional executables, and then there are newer executables like UWP or Universal Windows Platform apps, things like apps from the Windows App Store. During incident response, Joel was able to determine that while those executables are digitally signed, you can't validate them in a normal way. His goal in his research was to find a way to, at scale, even remotely across one's environment, verify the cryptographic signatures of UWP apps. It's a phenomenal paper, and it's of real value to the incident response community as a whole, including preemptive incident detection, because he showed how to take digital signatures and apply the concepts in different ways. Secondly, he also showed something that is also a really interesting perspective, that if the executables in one system should be cryptographically signed, then the presence of non-signed executables could be considered suspicious. Or to say differently, there isn't a single existence of a universal Windows platform app that would ever be on a system if it wasn't digitally signed by Microsoft as a part of the App Store. If an adversary hid their executable in plain sight, here it is, it's right before your eyes, but it looks legitimate because of its location, we could detect it by the presence of the lack of a signature. Now, that's not necessarily a new concept, but it's a great concept that Joel showed the practical value of as applied in these concepts and the ideas overall. So I highly recommend his paper, along with Tim Lansing's paper, on some of the technologies we've discussed. Now, finally, to start to get towards the end of the conclusion here of our presentation, I keep saying that the idea of digital signatures is too much to ignore. But really what I want to say is that public-private key pair cryptography is so much more than just digital signatures itself. The idea of a mathematical relationship between a private key and a public key is the most powerful form of authentication. It would be so difficult to spoof. We would say that it's very improbable because of the mathematical relationship itself and how trusted that relationship is, which means we can use public-private key pairs for concepts such as whole disk encryption, confidentiality. We can leverage it for generic user authentication, certificates, smart cards, and so on. We can leverage that to verify an identity for IPsec, VPNs, wireless, network access control, and so much more. It would behoove us then to take advantage of understanding important cryptographic concepts. And I think the key takeaway here is to show that in only 52 minutes of a presentation, we have more than enough information to more accurately deploy some of these really important concepts and technologies. With that being said, then, I would open it up to any questions because we're almost at the end. We have a few minutes left in our scheduled time. Let's go ahead here and take a look to see if any questions have come up. Carol, do we have any questions?
Yeah. I'm not currently seeing any questions. So if anyone does have anything for Bryan, oh, one just popped in. What if private key has been stolen?
Okay, so yes, the question is, if one's private key was stolen, what then? The moment we believe our private key has been compromised, we must immediately cease using it and then tell the entire world, so to speak, that the private key from this point in time going forward can never be trusted again. It's still trusted for everything that happened prior to compromise. The only way, and this is the difficulty, there's no way to tell the world your private key has been compromised, but there is a way to tell the world your public key is subsequently no longer trusted. The private key and the public key are a pair. Whatever happens to one happens to the other. If I have a certificate issued by a trusted authority that has my public key inside of it, I go to the trusted authority and I tell them to revoke my certificate. The moment my certificate for my public key is revoked, my private key is no longer trusted. So from that point in time going forward, I'm not responsible for my private key. Anything prior to the point in time of revocation, I am responsible for, which is why if one did believe their private key was stolen, we would have to revoke the public key as quickly as possible because we are responsible for it. So I hope that answers the question. I think it probably does, but if there's a follow-up, please feel free to ask as well.
You read their mind. There's a follow-up. They said, what if we don't know it's been stolen?
This question that comes up next, this is one of the things I discussed in 401 is, I'll repeat the question here as a part of getting to it. Well, how would I know my private key was stolen? This is a real issue we face in the digital world that I find interesting because in the physical world, we have physical keys to lock and unlock our door. And I'm willing to bet that anyone listening right now, if I asked you to find your key for your door, your physical key, I bet you know where it is right now. If it's not on you, you know exactly where it is. And you would know if your key was lost or stolen, that being a physical key. In the digital world, though, this question comes up, and it's a great question, because if we don't know where the private key is, how could we ever make a claim of security? Now, translate that question to a database administrator who's told to deploy encryption as per regulation. If they're unaware of the private key is, they would never know to secure it. Now, I know that the question is probably more, how would I know if my private key was compromised? So the first thing that you would ask is, where would it be? Now, if we're talking, we'll just use digitally signing email. If we're talking all things being equal, and you're using a software application on your computer to do this, like to write your email, then the private key is probably on your hard drive. But where in the hard drive? Depends on the operating system. There can be things called the certificate store in like Windows. There can be things in Linux where you have private keys in your root directory for your home directory. But yes, we would have to put monitoring, and we'd have to know that it was stolen. And this is one of the things I discuss quite heavily, in the concepts of the class, as to how we start to bring that up and to approach it. So I know it's not the exact specific answer that you're probably looking for, but the idea is we'd have to determine where that private key is. For me, my private key will be on secure storage. Things like smart cards can provide that aspect. Great. So
All
are
right,
there any
thanks.
other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, so the last question asks, so the certificate authority is central or distributed?
Oh, excellent. So the question is, for certificate authority, is this central or distributed? The answer is yes, it's both. There is the idea that there will be a centralized aspect where you have your original root certification authority, but then they will create subordinate CAs, ones that are like issuing certificate authorities. So there becomes a chain of trust relative to all the certificates that were issued on a hierarchical manner. So it's a hierarchy. So it is centralized but distributed at the same time. Our operating systems, just to highlight this, will come with public keys, certificates for certificate authorities that the operating system vendor trusts. Web browsers might come with the same as well. So that's part of what that is then.
All right, well, that's all we
Actually,
have.
okay, I just see one that popped up on my window somehow here. Um, I've seen that validation by an issuing authority is not always exhaustive. Oh, I see. They call the number you provide and so on. The point of the comment or the question is, well, Brian, why would we trust a certificate authority? Or to say it differently, why would we have confidence in something that's issued by a CA, like a public key? And this goes back to earlier part of the conversation, that when someone gives me a passport, I have to assume that a lot of effort went into what had to be proven for the identity of that passport. And yes, the point here being made is that the comment is, I've seen validation done by an issuing authority that's not exhaustive. They might call a phone number, they check some records online, but you might be able to lie and deceive. A certificate authority will often list on their website their practices that they follow for validation. But this is an issue overall because it has happened in the past where a certificate authority has been deceived into issuing certificates for Google, Yahoo, and others. And if you're in a position of an in-the-middle attack where an adversary intercepts you, they replace the legitimate certificate with the fake one. But because the fake one was issued by someone we trust, we trust. At the end of the day, we have to give in to trust somewhere, and there has to be a line that's drawn, and this will be far from perfect. But if we keep those methods in mind and we hold CAs accountable and they follow best practices, then we can have more confidence and more trust than not. But it's an excellent comment.
All right, well, that's all the questions we have today. Thank you so much, Brian, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.